Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? Now, Ahimelech, according to all the commentaries, Ahimelech the priest, high priest, okay, he's the same guy named Ahiah in chapter 14, verse 3. 1 Samuel 14:3. And if you don't need to recap that and see what I taught on that, go back and listen to that first couple of minutes of that one, because it'll make a lot more sense in this chapter and then in chapter 22 of the things that transpire. So knowing that Ahimelech is actually Ahiah, the high priest, back in chapter 14, verse 3. Anyway, all the commentaries, most of them that I looked at, validate that. So anyway, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, well, another thing too in verse 1, he said he was afraid at the meeting of David. And then in light of, what I taught in chapter 14, he really should have been full of joy when he met David, right? Because David's anointed. And if he's the high priest, the job of the high priest was to steward the anointing plus the office of the priest, okay? And so, but this guy was religious. And so you can see what happened here when David came in. The first thing that came to his heart was fear, because they probably knew a little bit about David, that Saul was trying to kill David. So when David showed up, he wasn't rejoicing to see David. He was afraid for his life, because he thought maybe David had come with ill intent, or else that he would have something bad happen to him because of Saul, because Saul was looking for David to kill him. Anyway, so look at that. That'll explain a lot of this, the next two chapters actually. And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said to me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. In other words, David was lying to him and telling him he was on a secret mission. Nobody was to know, okay? So in other words, that he was avoiding letting Ahimelech know that Saul hadn't sent him. So anyway, verse 3. Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under my hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, Of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days, since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of herdmen that belonged to Saul. So basically what that is, the detained before the Lord, is it's a ceremonial cleansing. So that's like the part of the priest's office was to provide that for the common people, and they would come in and bring offerings and stuff like that. And but it very ceremonial, very religious by this time. That's what was going on. So Saul had been hanging out with Ahiah or Ahimelech, and So obviously he was requiring that of his servants to go and do their religious duties. Go get cleansed, go through the ceremonial stuff. But that has no power over the demonic, and so it's just religious. It's powerless. So that's what Doeg was there for. That's what it means, detained before the Lord. I think I covered that too, like in the book of Acts, when Paul went to Jerusalem, and all the way on the way, these prophets were prophesying to him and telling him not to go to Jerusalem. And God knew the kind of demons that had entered into the church there at Jerusalem, in the Christian church and everything else, and especially in Judaism, by the Judaizing Christians, plus the people that hadn't even been converted to Christianity. These principalities and powers, it was very heavy atmosphere there. And God knew that nothing Paul would do, he wouldn't even be able to hook up with anybody there that would be have a strong enough threefold cord or whatever to break the yoke of those principalities that had come in and pretty much compromised the church at Jerusalem. So I covered that, and one of the things that Paul did was when he got there, against the will of God and against the revelation that he'd been getting, he was faced with the fact that the people wouldn't believe he was a real Christian. And they were referring to the Jews wouldn't believe him and would be out to get him. And so what he did was he hooked up with a ceremonial vow where he shaved his head and whatnot, or they did, 3 guys, I guess. And that was supposed to be testimony that he was a good, that he was a good Jew. He was abiding by the law of Moses. And if he would partake in that ceremonial vow and cleansing and all that. But if you read that record, that's when he gets put in prison. See, the principalities, they just go through that like, they eat that for breakfast. Anything that's under the law or legal, now that in this time that we live in, it doesn't have any power over the principalities and over the demons. It may have power with men, but not with devils. So that's why God was giving him, all the prophets' revelation to keep Paul from going there, because it doesn't have power over the demonic strongholds that we've been called to have to stand against. So in this situation, that's just a little background, but that's what it meant that he was detained before the Lord. He was doing religious duty, and I think Saul had become really religious too, so he was probably requiring it of all his, all the people that served under him. And so David's got kind of caught up in this thing where he's on the run, and that's not a good place to be. And then the first person he runs into is this priest who's afraid of him. So David's dealing with an atmosphere of fear, and he's, anyway, that's what he's doing, and he's on the run. So it doesn't mean that he had any other options. I don't know if he did, but that's kind of what's going on here. So anyway, this Doeg plays in to this chapter here, and also in chapter 22. So, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and do chapter 21 as one recording. So you can go back and put time into it and look and, get some background yourself on this. In verse 8, and David said to Ahimelech, and is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. And David said, there is none like that, give it me. And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. So, Proverbs 29:2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. So that's the situation that's happening. There's an atmosphere of fear, and David's caught up in it. And so you can see that David's on the run too. So this is the type of discerning of spirits that it's pretty easy to spot. When you see fear, it's a spirit of cowardice, right? In Timothy, it says that God hasn't given us the spirit of fear, which is cowardice, where you don't stand up to the opponent, to the adversary, right? It says He hasn't given us that kind of a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. So that's what we're seeing here. We don't even know if there were any other options for David. But what he's running into, once you get on the run, then of course, then you're hanging out with people who are on the run. You're hanging out with people that have fear, and they're not on the offense. They're on the defense. So it doesn't help you. It's not a good threefold cord. It's not even a threefold cord. It's a compromise. David's running into all these people that are compromised, and it's not really doing him much good. It's not strengthening him in the Lord, but he is getting out of the situation because he's anointed, and he's got God's, God is directing him how to keep from being hurt. But he hasn't run into anybody yet that will strengthen him. He does actually in chapter 22. God sends him a prophet, and then he ends up hooking up with some other people after that. So anyhow, you follow that one. I wanted to cover Isaiah 8 too. That's a good one regarding fear and regarding being apart or being hooked up with people who are not walking with God, and people who are basically under the influence of principalities and powers. And if we're not aggressive and we're not actually ministering to that, I mean, like you and me, then we can fall under the same compromise that they're under. And so that's why we have to be vigilant and diligent and walk by the Spirit and keep pushing to grow up in the Lord and keep focusing on the Word and keep putting the Word on, putting on the mind of Christ. So we want to always stay on the offense in the Spirit, okay? So that's what it is. Anyway, Isaiah chapter 8 in verse 11, it says, "For the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand." That means he really, he was talking like your dad would talk to you, if he wanted you to listen and he wanted to, make sure you got the message, okay? He spoke to me, Isaiah, with a strong hand and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people. Which is what David is he's hanging out with these people, right? He goes to see the priest, happens to be a priest that doesn't have the Spirit of the Lord. He's just going through the motions. He's going through all the ceremonial stuff, but no Spirit of God, okay? The first thing the guy does is he's full of fear when he sees David. So that doesn't help. That doesn't help the old heart, does it? You come across people like that. And then David arises in verse 10 and flees for fear of Saul. So you can see David's caught up in it too. So it's not healthy. It's not a good place to be. So that's why God's telling Isaiah with a strong hand, don't walk in the way of this people. Okay, saying, verse 12, say ye not a confederacy. In other words, don't Don't agree. Don't come into agreement with this type of fear, unbelief, and powerless, behavior. Okay. Say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy. So that would have to do with anybody that was in agreement with the demonic in any way too, right? A principality or religious spirits or stuff like that. Don't come into agreement with them. Okay, that's why we have discerning of spirits, so we know what we're dealing with. Then we know how to minister to the person. We want to stand against that, what they're in cahoots with. We want to call evil evil and love people. So, a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. So that fits. I've got that as a little side note here in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. That's what basically this chapter is dealing with. David dealing with the spirit of timidity. People are moaning. They're under a leadership that is basically wicked, and that's Saul. Saul turned that way. We read that in Proverbs 29 too. All the people moan. So that's kind of the atmosphere of what's going on. So that's why I want to cover those verses. Okay, now verse 11. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land? So Achish is the king of Gath, okay, and that's where David went. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So see how he's on the run, right? He doesn't have vision for dealing with this situation. He's looking for help, really. He's looking for people that he can get help from, okay? But we know that our help's in the Lord, right? So really what he needs is he needs a threefold cord, right? He needs to run into some people that know God. And none of these guys do. So, and he changed his behavior, verse 13, before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see the man is mad. Wherefore then have ye brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So, anyway, it's kind of a disheartening chapter for me. Because, David gets caught. He's on the run. But what's neat is in chapter 22, he goes off. Actually, he continues to hide out, and God sends a prophet by the name of Gad in verse 5. So I'm not going to cover chapter 22 now. I'm going to just make this a short recording. But, you could read on yourself into chapter 22, and you'll see that God bails him out. He sends a prophet in to him and tell him not to hide out. Don't go hiding in the caves, but go this other place. So it's the same type of thing. It's like sometimes we get so caught in the atmosphere and what's going on around us that we're not actually discerning the condition that we're in. We're not discerning it properly. So, then God can speak through another believer too. So this prophet bails him out in chapter 22. But David wasn't running into anybody that could confirm the Spirit of the Lord in him. He couldn't couldn't make a connection with anybody in this chapter 21. In fact, he was getting pretty close to being compromised, actually. When anytime you see somebody in the Word where they're acting out of fear, then they're on the run. They're not aggressive. They're not in a position where they're in authority. They're dominating the conditions that they're under. So we can look at that now. I mean, I don't even know if they had a paradigm for that back in those days under the law, but we do, because we've been redeemed out from under the law, which was it was a stopgap for the weakness of the flesh under the Old Testament. But we have the Spirit now sealed. We're sealed by the Spirit, so we know that the Spirit gives life. The Spirit always gives answers, gives direction, and it has the power to break the yoke of the demonic yoke, and those types of things, and run the devils off out of people's hearts. So anyway, that's it. It's kind of a filler chapter there for us, and we'll get into chapter 22. That's got a lot of pretty good stuff in it, and take note there that this Ahimelech in verse 1 is Ahiah of chapter 14, verse 3. And that will make a lot more sense to you, I think, if you go back and you take a look at that after this, we're done here. So I think that's about it. So the next one, I'm going to start up again in chapter 22.